Okay, so I'm going to chat to you about Paddy Griffith and the Operation Sealion game, which took place at Sandhurst and the Staff College in 1974. But let's get down to the important bits first. This picture definitively proves that Paddy Griffith did have hair once. That's the back of his head.
Well, allegedly, because because it's the back of his head, we can't really tell whether it's Paddy.
Yeah. Okay, no, it is. Trust me. Trust me. So, Paddy Griffith obtained a prestigious lectureship at Sandhurst in 1973 when they're expanding their war studies department, and they decided instead of just teaching military history at GCSE level or O level standard, they were going to teach something about tactical and operational level military history. So Brigadier Peter Young, who was head of the war studies at Sandhurst at that time, was looking for suitable military historians with a focus on tactical matters. So Don Featherstone suggested Paddy. Peter Young knew Don well. Now, it's impossible to know what influence Don's recommendation did, but it can't have hurt at the interview panel being recommended by a World War II veteran who was the best known wargamer in the UK and also had a sound reputation for writing popular military history in his books. So Paddy landed at Sandhurst. There he is. Bob Corduroy has supplied definitive proof he was there.
Oh, excellent.
Yes. So this talk came out of my research for a couple of books I published recently. One on Wargaming Operation Sealion, the story of the game, and also a more general one about Paddy's contribution to wargaming. Now, how can I describe Paddy? Okay, so he gets to the Sandhurst, wanders along to the Staff College and say, would you like to play a game about history? And the CEO of the Staff College in a memo says, no. Paddy Griffith says, oh, okay, I'll do all the organising. CEO of the Staff College in a memo says, no, exclamation mark. But it would demonstrate the academic value of wargaming to the study of military history. CEO of the Staff College, no, which part of no don't you understand? Thinking, where is this upstart academic come from? And then Paddy casually drops into the conversation. Of course, General Sir John Hackett says it's a great idea. The Daily Telegraph is sponsoring it. I've invited 6 generals already to take part. So then the reply is, okay, which date would you like the war game? How did Sir John Hackett get 6 mentioned in dispatches and still be alive, let alone all those medals? I've got no idea. So what Paddy had done in his ignorance of proper procedure, it's just gone ahead and organised it and then decided to tell them afterwards. So the game was on. So the game was about Operation Sealion, which is clearly the biggest non-battle in history. And the game was really exploring, could it have possibly have worked? Now, I quite like this picture. It's an amphibious Panzer II. Yeah, gosh. And that's in calm waters. Can you imagine it off the seas off Britain coming in? Yeah. So, what ifs are an important part of history. They're speculative fiction, it's very popular. And Paddy's view that war games can actually inform these books. So instead of having very plausible narratives, what you would have is a war game informing that plausible narrative. So, could Operation Sealion worked? Well, of course, if we go back to the wisdom of Admiral Jervis, he said about the French, I did not say, my lords, that the French will not come. I say only they will not come by sea. And actually, he was probably right. Now, Operation Sealion had been studied immediately after World War II. In fact, during World War II, it was a matter of great interest. And I quite like this book, published in 1958. It was by a fighter pilot, but actually said the air battle hardly mattered. The fact the Royal Navy would have stopped them. But of course, speculative fiction, people kept on saying, well, of course, the Germans could have succeeded if this. So the game was sponsored by the Daily Telegraph, and you've got to realise that in that time, the Daily Telegraph was part of the British establishment. You know, the Daily Telegraph, for example, could talk to the Ministry of Defence, could talk to Sandhurst, could talk to the Staff College. I mean, you know, they were seen as really important. Obviously, the Guardian would have been, but Daily Telegraph would have been. So the game was actually run at the Staff College, but the opening parts of it were actually run at Sandhurst. So both institutions could lay claim to the fact they ran the illustrious war game. Now, some of the senior umpires, I mean, you know, talk about seniority. How could you get better than that? But of course, rather than talk about those, we must say that Andy Callan was actually the key person. There he is, Andy Callan, looking somewhat younger than he does today. He was listed as a very experienced wargamer. When it got queried, it said that Andy Callan led an advanced wargaming group at university. I assume he was an undergraduate there. And he even had to borrow a jacket to come along to the game. Other people, it lists a Lieutenant Featherstone, and I'm just wondering whether that was Don Featherstone, who was promoted for the benefit of getting him through the door so he could observe the game, because Don was, you know, one of the key wargamers at the time. And it would have amused Don no end, mixing with all these high-ranking generals. Alex pointed out Al Murray's father, that's Al Murray We Have Ways podcast, was actually one of the umpires at the game. And he was actually Galland's ADC at the game. He was listed as a major then. There was also John Davis from Wargame Developments. I'll mention him again later. David Candler, of course. He had 8 generals and admirals. And of course, he had Air Chief Marshal Foxley-Norris, who had a ridiculous number of letters after his name. The seniority of the umpires at that game was ridiculous. And I would suggest in the history of war games, professional, amateur, rarely have we seen quite so many senior ranks actually of one game. Many NATO war games would have been pleased to have that number of people involved at that rank. Now, the game launched a work of fiction, Operation Sealion, a novel what might have been. Now, it was well written. Paddy obviously hated it because it didn't actually discuss any aspects of the game. It simply used the scenario and casually mentioned, oh yeah, there was a war game, by the way, and here's the story of that war game. It's a good book if you can find it out there. It's quite entertaining. Now, the game consisted of 2 parts. They looked at the Battle of Britain and thought, well, how can you have Operation Sealion if you don't give the players the opportunity to make different decisions during the Battle of Britain? So they refought the second half of the Battle of Britain. That's from start of September. They said Operation Sealion is going ahead. Now they said that clearly the Germans, with historical hindsight, the players would know more about the RAF defences than in fact they did. So the Germans, instead of bombing London, actually focused on fighter command and the Navy's anti-invasion forces. And they only switched to bombing London intensively 2 days before the invasion. That was important because of the rail networks in Britain. If you block London, it would take longer for the trains to get to the invasion site. Now, how did they run this game? Well, it was run at Sandhurst 2 days. Obviously, he used the Sandhurst computer. Yeah, it was just one computer, by the way. He got some of the top Ministry of Defence programmers, probably both of them, involved in doing this, pulled them away from things, but Paddy said this was really important. Look, all these generals are coming, program my computer. And what the German players did in the game, they initiated the raids one by one. They're plotted on the RAF players' maps as they're detected. The RAF then decide what fighter squadrons to send up. And then the computer comes up with the answer about the vital statistics. Did they intercept it? What's the weather like? What's the target? What's the outcomes, etc. And random factors added according to historical variability. Then you get the results of each raid, what actually happened, the aircraft lost from each side, bomb damage, etc. And the estimate of what each side get told according to their intelligence services. This is all based on solid historical data. Here's an example just here. This is just random from the hundreds of pages of printout, because remember, they're doing this raid by raid. So this raid at the top, intercepted by 3 British squadrons. Yeah, British lost 6 planes, Germans only lost 4. Germans got the target. The AA was particularly effective. It managed to hit 1 plane, but the airfield got hit by 1 bomb, which stopped flying for 1 minute, which is the time it took someone with a shovel to fill in the hole. Now, of course, I don't know how many German planes were in that raid. I haven't got that bit. What about this one? 4 British squadrons intercept. British lose 21 planes. German losses 12 planes, not so good. AA, not particularly effective. Target hit by 12 bombs, but the aircraft production was held up for 0 days. 12 bombs, don't hit anything important in the factory, no impact whatsoever. So what can we say about this? Well, the umpiring and the rules which inform this computer program were based on World War II combat experience. So they're veterans, they're senior ranks, and the rules actually, which we've now got for that game, I think they're really exciting because they are pretty good operational analysis for that period of 1940. So the Germans started well on the 7th and 8th. They putting out 4 radar stations temporarily out of action, and they hit the group command centre for the whole of southeast England. Now, the RAF, mind you, were having an argument over big wing or small wing. So do you commit squadrons individually, or do you get your squadrons into the air, then form up with other squadrons, and then go and attack with multiple squadrons at the same time? Now, Paddy called the debate the RAF players were having acrimonious. Now, remember, if that's Paddy Griffith calling the debate acrimonious, what were they doing? Dueling with swords or something? I've got no idea. But anyway, eventually they decided it was going to be based on small wing. I think in the end, the senior British commander said, tough, I'm in charge, this is what you can do. So what the British did was, as soon as they got a squadron in the air, they intercepted. Obviously, the British squadron would be outnumbered by the German planes, a dogfight would develop, and then more and more British squadrons would arrive, but almost certainly that would break the German formations and allow the British actually to get at the bombers. You get amongst the bombers, you cause chaos, reducing the chance of damage. So the Germans were over-optimistic, actually. So despite historical hindsight, they thought they'd shot down 600 RAF planes, when actually they shot down 137. And for some reason, they had a mental block that radar stations could be repaired. And they failed completely to hit any of the mobile stations. They also didn't realize that hitting the grass airfields, well, those were repaired pretty quickly. See, if you hit a grass airfield and you smash the repair shops, you hit the control tower, you know, you've had an impact, but actually just blowing up a grass airfield is not wildly effective. So I conclude actually that the RAF outfought them in the war game. What I think probably happened is the British RAF of 1974 thought we're going to put our best foot forward, and they probably did have an awful lot of advisors on the British side, which the German players didn't realise. So basically, the RAF outfought the Germans. Right. So let's just look at a few key weapons. Now, this is from Paddy's notes. Now, Paddy was not wildly impressed with the Stuka dive bomber. He said, did it have more bark than bite? Because he said, well, it can credibly aim at point targets. A Stuka stands a 1% chance of hitting a stationary pinpoint target, which is pretty good, isn't it? So you've got a squadron of 12 aircraft. You stand about 12% chance of actually hitting it. However, the losses in the game were catastrophic. They lost 78 out of the 80 Stukas in the game, though there were 35 replacements during the battle, and Germany also had strategic reserves of Stukas which they could bring forward. But the loss rate of 78 out of 80, the problem with Stukas is once you've seen them once, even with something like a Bren gun and a tripod, once you've seen a Stuka once, you realize how it works. And if you're 500 paces away, so you know the bomb is not actually going to land on you, you plot its trajectory down, you aim ahead of it and squeeze the trigger, and you may stand a 20 or 30% chance of actually putting rounds actually into the plane. And that's just with a Bren gun. So if you've got lots of Bren guns firing, all doing this, you know, you're going to knock out Stuka planes pretty quickly. So Paddy was not wildly impressed with the Stukas, but the Germans just threw them all into the battle. He also gave this as an example, which was during the Norwegian campaign. He pointed out it took the Stukas more than a day to actually hit her. Obviously, they did. It was catastrophic, but it's more than a day to do it. As for high-level bombers, he pulled up this one, which was midway 1942. This is the Japanese carrier under B-17 attack, and there are the bombs going off. So high-level bombers against ships steaming at speed were not wildly effective, despite all the arguments of them. And it's interesting, actually, that people who are like the generals, the land commanders, clearly thought that the Luftwaffe should be able to hit stuff with the Stukas, and the high-level bombers clearly should be able to knock out ships. No idea of the issues. So this is actually the start of the game, and there they are. Now, there were a lot of other little people around, officers, runners, and all the rest of it. They had a lot of people taking part in this game. There's the board just there. Battle of Britain type movement sticks. Now, the only slight problem is the players saw the map. So when they were doing their planning, the British players looked at the map and said, oh, okay, I'm pretty certain, looking at the map, which the Royal Engineers have built for this game, I'm pretty certain I know where the Germans are going to land. It's either reduced the impact of the strategic deception. So that was a bit disappointing. But nice photograph, though, isn't it? I wonder who that person is sat there who hasn't got a jacket on. Now, the Germans gave orders in German. So one of the things I had to do was actually translate them, because the German players were all German, of course. And they had really detailed orders. They'd really looked at this. They were based largely on historical orders. But, they were aiming to win, and they were trying their very best. Now, the deception plan, they made extensive efforts with the deception plan, but there's one slight problem with it. Well, they were making a feint attack on Hartlepool. And obviously the British realized this and said, would it really matter if the Germans occupy Hartlepool for a few weeks or even a few months? Yeah, I think there was a gross cultural misunderstanding if they thought that anyone was going to react to Hartlepool being invaded. But they were having feint attack and dummy parachutes, and then they dropped sabotage troops. And just like in 1944, when we dropped paratroopers, obviously the paratroopers went all over the place, couldn't find anything, blew up random things, and no one even noticed they were there for the duration of the game. So, extensive deception plans. Wow. So the original Sealion plan, I'm sure you're all familiar with it. This is the idea that day one, you land Hastings to Dover. You're aiming to take Folkestone. You land the paratroopers with a view to taking Folkestone. And then shortly afterwards, you then go and extend the bridgehead down here. And the aim is to rapidly move to a line southeast of London and south of London with a view to taking the capital by storm. Now, we can see the map just here. So there's some good photographs of it in the archives. John Davis took a whole series of photographs, actually, and I was fortunate enough to see him before he passed away. So this is at the start of it. So nice little wooden blocks. The landing at the beaches. Those are the main railway lines. These are the British units here. That's the white blocks. Aircraft coming in. So everything's going fine at the start. Now, of course, the Germans are using their invasion barges, which come across at a staggering 3 or 4 knots. Often they're towed by another barge, which is under power. But they've also got minesweepers, etc., and they have some car ferries, etc., which can land some tanks. Of course, they have their amphibious tanks as well. Hopefully, they would all get to shore. So, mid-morning, the Brits fall back. So you can see a photograph here. What do the British units do? Well, the British units are being forced back by the weight of the German attack over the beaches. Now, by the end of the day, reinforcements started to arrive very rapidly. And if you look at here, you see these German blocks. But if you look at here, just how many British blocks seem to have appeared out of actually nowhere. And all of these are brigade units. Off here, off to the right, there's a heavy air battle going on. And just there, you'll start to see the lead units of the Royal Navy start to come bang, and they're escorted by the RAF. So in the game, they found by the end of the first day, the British were able to move large amounts of forces towards the beachheads. Now, nighttime, the Royal Navy rules. So if you see here, during the night, the British brigades are advancing towards the beachhead, more are coming down, and there's the Royal Navy there, end of day one. Now, after 2 days, the German land forces realized they were encountering rapid British reinforcements. And at night, the Royal Navy were cutting the supply lines. They committed destroyers. They didn't commit light cruisers, heavy cruisers, or battleships or anything like that, because they decided they could be vulnerable in the Channel. The German coastal batteries were firing away. And interestingly enough, actually, the coastal batteries between 1940 to 1944 on the German side failed to hit one ship, and they only killed one sailor, and that was a near miss on a ship, and that was splinters. So they weren't wildly effective, but they tried hard. During the daytime, there was heavy air fighting, and then the Germans gave the order to withdraw, which perhaps surprised some of the umpires, and they did it while they still had supplies to move. Because when they landed, they had about 2 days worth of supplies, and they decided, well, if they weren't going to break the back of the British Army within 2 days, if the German Navy couldn't get the supplies across the Channel, if the Luftwaffe could not suppress the Navy, they had to do something quickly while they still had supplies to move. Interesting enough, actually, Eisenhower in his planning for D-Day said if D-Day failed, they would need to start withdrawing on day 2, and that was probably for the same reasons. Now, what was the post-game debrief? Now, it's interesting. So there was extensive debriefs by academics and the generals, etc. And it was pretty good-natured, and they largely agreed. So even with a detailed knowledge of the British radar and fighter control network, the Luftwaffe remained largely unable to destroy the RAF, because the problem is the bombing of that time was simply not good enough. It was hard enough to hit a town or a city at times, let alone a pinpoint target. Now, they failed to achieve strategic surprise, and the German players said, well, the problem is the British have seen them out. But of course, the British players said, okay, we looked at your complex deception plans, but we knew the invasion was coming from barges. The barges would only be coming across at 3 to 4 knots. Those were the places you had to land. You might be able to go 10 miles this way or 10 miles that way, but there's no way you can be landing in Scotland. When the German landing actually went in, there appears to have been confusion as to the actual strengths involved. So the German players didn't appreciate the fact that when they landed on the beaches, there seemed to be confusion about units got intermingled, brigades got intermingled. Sometimes they went the wrong way. They weren't clear who they were fighting on the British side. They couldn't identify the brigades they were fighting. There was actually just confusion about the strengths involved. But to me, that's what happens when you launch an invasion, an amphibious invasion. And interestingly enough, Admiral Ruge pointed out that when he looked at examples of amphibious assaults in World War II, there was a real psychological tendency for the landing forces to dig in too close to the sea. So that's what happened in this game, is the Germans landed, but there was not enough pressure to push them forward. They should have gone in as fast as possible, but they didn't. They sort of dug in too close to the sea, so they had too narrow a bridgehead. So essentially, the war game reflects what happened in real life. Now, the German army criticised the Luftwaffe heavily and said, well, you were just not playing your part. This is not true. And Paddy wrote pages and pages and pages to point out all the effort the Luftwaffe was making. The basic problem was there weren't enough planes and the technology at the time was not actually good enough to hit ships unless they were lucky. It needed training, and they weren't that good at hitting land targets. You know, you might hit a town, but a factory, phew. And as for a brigade which is dug in, gosh. Another problem the Germans had is England was full of railways. Now, one of the senior officers umpiring the game hobby was railways. And in his head, he knew the railway timetables of 1940. So when they phoned up in the game and said, right, we want to move a brigade from here to here, this chap actually knew the railway timetables 1940. He knew the tonnage, and he could produce a mental model within minutes. He was coming back, what could move where and how quickly. And this was in the days before beaching, before the railway cuts, and the British railway network was really complex, and German bombs weren't that accurate, and they probably didn't understand what the railway network anyway, how it all worked anyway, and where the loops were, etc. So actually, it was really hard to try and stop the British reinforcements being sent. The Germans even attempted to assassinate Churchill at the end of the game. No dice roll was needed because they simply went to the wrong place. But good attempt. I like that. Nice little twist. Now, this is a picture of the game, and this is Adolf Galland there, showing off his war pictures. Obviously, when veterans get together, that's the type of thing which happens. And John Davis told me an interesting story. He said that Adolf Galland had actually shot down Foxley-Norris off the cliffs of Dover. Now, I looked up Foxley-Norris's war record, and that isn't there. But perhaps what I could say is Adolf Galland was involved in an air battle there. Foxley-Norris was involved, and perhaps Foxley-Norris his aircraft was damaged, not actually shot down. But, you know, your veterans meeting, and it'd be a nice story, wouldn't it, you know, to say, oh, yeah, of course you shot me down. And it didn't actually happen. But it's a good story anyway. Not sure it's true. Anyway, I quite like the fact the Minister of Defence, by the way, sent someone down because these were foreigners. So obviously you had to have someone supervising foreigners at the British Defence Establishment, even though they're all part of NATO. So after the game, what happened was John Doe said, hey, why don't you go on a trip? So he took them on a road trip. Now, this was in the Churchill War Rooms. This was, remember, before they were opened. They were preserved after the end of World War II. So John Davis had arranged for them to go in because he said, you know, this is who these people were. And they went through the Churchill War Rooms in London. This is the way they went down to the cliffs of Dover. And they were looking with fascination, actually, and said, gosh, we were planning to land where? Gosh. What would have been the requirements for a successful Operation Sealion? You don't actually need air supremacy for an amphibious invasion at that time, because the aircraft aren't that good at hitting ships. You really need to be trained to do it. So it might be pretty terrible operating under air attack, but you could have done it. There is no possible way for the Royal Navy not to win the naval battle, which would leave them free to bombard the invasion ports, invasion beaches at night, and sink any ships or barges they can find. However, how could the Germans have won? Well, maybe if the Royal Navy took losses and were drawn, had panicked. So if by chance they'd lost a number of ships on day one, would they have panicked? I don't think they would, but you know, that could have allowed the operation to succeed. Maybe sea mines could have been an option. So on the German side, if you put every U-boat which could carry sea mines into carrying sea mines, and if you use the minesweepers, which you've got in the operation, that was it, something like 10 of them to drop sea mines, and every spare ship you've got out there, you're dropping sea mines. Well, the Royal Navy had only got 21 minesweepers. Maybe sea mines could have been the answer to stop the Royal Navy for a little while until these minesweepers had swept it. Another option to improve their chances would just been to seize one airfield, and you'd only land enough paratroopers to seize one airfield. On the rest of your effort, you could land 300 tons of supplies per day at that one airfield. And that might have been more useful than having 10,000 very hungry paratroopers. How else could the Germans have won? Well, if there'd been a British command paralysis, or maybe a British panic and were drawn to the GHQ line. Bath, Bristol, London, etc. Or maybe panic in Parliament and Parliament replaced Churchill and then ask for a ceasefire. It's really quite difficult, based on the evidence of this game, to see what changes you could make to history which could allow the Germans to actually succeed. And this is the unanimous agreement of all the umpires. So, interestingly enough, actually, was Sealion a British bluff? So Churchill knew all about the challenges of amphibious landings. But by reacting and bigging up the threat of a German landing, maybe it kept the German army tied up, and it did. It kept the Luftwaffe in a losing battle. So the RAF were retreating more aircraft than the RAF were losing. The U-boats were involved in preparations for Sealion, were trying to protect the potential invasion site, and that means they're not involved in blockading Britain. And the European economy was dislocated for many months by logistics build-up. So they had to strip the Rhine of barges in order to give enough barges for the German army to potentially launch an invasion. And that very conveniently puts the barges in harbour where the RAF could actually manage to hit them. So by 21st of September, they'd sunk 67 and damaged 173. And those are barges which are not quickly replaced. And maybe the biggest thing is the threat galvanized the whole of the British Empire politically and economically into total war. So I wonder whether, from Churchill's point of view, it was a bluff, it was a British bluff, because he wanted the Germans to keep up the threat for as long as possible because of these reasons. But I just want you to think for a moment, it's just I'm about to finish. It must have been an exciting game, mustn't it? A mega game, looking at this, all these maps, etc., these umpires, the experience, the World War II experience, the combat experience. It must have been a wonderful thing to take place. And it must have been a wonderful thing to take part in it. Absolutely. So, the game was the first to really demonstrate that wargames are a serious tool to explore military history. And when you pick up those many alternative history books, which sell on the shelves, you see them on the Amazon virtual bookshelves, and they have very plausible narratives about things happening. It's interesting when you actually put it into a game which integrates politics with geography, time, space, combat power, you realize most of these alternative histories are utter rubbish. So thank you, Paddy, for demonstrating that. I wish I'd been there.
Brilliant.